Namaskar viewers. Hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha. You're watching Perspective. A new round of tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump on dozens of countries took effect on Wednesday, the 9th of April. As many as 60 trading partners of the US have been subject to customized tariff rates, which the Trump administration has described as reciprocal tariffs. Reciprocal would mean they were based on what countries already charge the US in the form of existing tariffs, plus non-tariff barriers such as regulations. Chinese imports face a 104% tariff after China refused to back down from imposing retaliatory tariffs of 34% on the US, sparking fears of a trade war. 26% tariffs on imports from India have also come into full effect, in addition to 46% tariffs on Vietnam, 32% on Taiwan, 25% on South Korea, 24% on Japan, and 20% on the European Union. The impact of the sweeping tariffs on world economy and trade, strategies that different countries are now adopting to lessen the impact of the tariffs, and most importantly, how is India responding to its key exports to the US now being taxed at 26%? We'll discuss all this and much more in Perspective today. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Swaran Singh, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor, glad to have you with us on the telecast. Thank you for your time. And also delighted to welcome Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, former Secretary, MEA. He's currently a Professor of Diplomatic Practice. Ambassador, thank you for your time as well. Welcome to Sansad TV. So we'll discuss the impact of the tariffs and the response it is being met with globally. But to begin with, Ambassador, help us and our viewers understand what's at the heart of Donald Trump's move to impose such sweeping global tariffs.
Well, thank you for having us on the show to discuss this rather critical moment that has come about in the history of times, because this is something that we have not seen in a very, very long period of time. In a sense, what Trump has done is to upstage the multilateral trade system. The WTO is in peril because it means that the uniformity of MFN, or the most favored nation status, is no longer applicable. And one country can unilaterally impose tariffs on a range of other countries. And Mr. Trump has taken the precaution of going in for emergency economic measures within the United States to levy this particular kind of tariff measures that he's imposed. Essentially, what Trump seems to be saying is that the trade imbalances that the United States faced were not because of the declining competitiveness of the US economy, but actually because of unfair advantages that other countries were using to have this trade deficit that the US had run up. And so now the US wants to revalue the value of trades. And he has restricted it only to the trade in goods or merchandise imports and exports. In the services sector, the Americans have a significant trade advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And he has levied two tariff structures. One is a baseline tariff of 10% that will apply to all countries. And in addition to that, he is levying a reciprocal tariff, which, as you explained in your introduction, is a quantum which is based on the average tariff that is being levied by the other country, as well as a certain quotient that is being taken for the technical barriers to trade or the non-tariff barriers. And in totality, this is now going to be a sum that the US will levy on imports. And we are seeing the impact of it already. It was announced on the 2nd of April, and it comes into effect today. And what we do see is that a number of countries are beginning to work out the response. China has gone in for retaliatory tariff and been imposed with a further additional tariff of 50%. The European Union is trying to work out its strategy. India, as you know, has already been in trade negotiations with the Americans and has given the indication that it will not wage retaliatory tariffs. Some other countries have suggested that they will reduce their tariff levels and go for a 0 for 0 kind of an option. But we'll have to wait and see how this happens.
Absolutely. We'll discuss in greater detail how India is strategizing the move in order to lessen the impact. That is something we will come to in due course of the program, Professor Singh. But to begin with, your thoughts also on the reasons that the US president has cited. And one of the important aspects being that he thinks this will help restore the lost manufacturing glory in his country. How do you look at it, or do you think it's going to happen otherwise? It's going to lead to recession, it's going to lead to price rise, and what are the implications that you see largely on America's economy and as a fallout on the global economy as well?
Thank you, Tina, for having me on your program. The easiest way to see what is happening is to look at how the stock market is responding to these tariff hikes. Second, I think it's a fundamentally global unleashing of disruption. And there is already likelihood of inflation, definitely, but even global recession, which is being spoken of, which means the impacts are going to be really global in nature. And we are talking of about United States, 86 or so partner nations are getting directly impacted in various ways in that sense. But at core of it fundamentally is a problem between two gigantic economies, which collectively, United States and China, constitute over 40% of the global GDP of 200 nations. And here the problem is that you just mentioned that the manufacturing of United States has over years lost ground to the Chinese. And China today accounts for between 30 to 35% of global manufacturing. Again, one country of 200 countries is manufacturing 35% of the global manufacturing sector. And as a result, for about 2 decades, China has also emerged as world's largest trading nation. So the fundamental problem here is that China today has trillion plus deficit in its global trade in its favor. Reverse is true of United States, which has trillion plus trade deficit against it. So it is not just the loss of competitiveness in manufacturing sector. Of course, as Ambassador said, they are still much better in services, but it's fundamentally a feeling of losing ground to Chinese in terms of global leadership, global engagement. And that is where this concern of trade deficit of President Donald Trump is something that has been brought forward to say we need to act, we need to rectify situation. And it's a crisis management, crisis kind of approach in a hurry to raise tariffs as high as 100% against the Chinese, which I think is going to be adding only to disruption between the various countries. India so far has been of the major economies on slightly advantage. Donald Trump says we from India impose of about 52% tariffs on American exports, but the tariffs imposed on India are about 26%. So India also is among the major economies, and therefore when there is a major disruption in relations among major economies, and European Union again, for example, is responding in a very interesting fashion, rather in a mute and imperceptive style of categorizing exports that come from United States to Europe from what they called red states, which are states that had voted for Donald Trump, to pick up those commodities. And second, impose the European tariffs on American exports to Europe in a staggered manner. Some of them beginning on 15th of this month, others had beginning in 16th of next month, and the final tranche will begin in 1st of December this year. So each group of countries, each country, China is confronting, India is conversing, India is trying to sign a trade agreement. So different countries are kind of gearing up to the situation differently. But fundamental question for all the countries today is how to become less dependent on United States. And without speaking about it, I think most countries are beginning to think on that line.
Certainly. So the opportunities that this crisis is going to create is also another aspect of debate. But Ambassador, your thoughts now on India's response. It's been quite interesting because we've adopted a very cautious approach. Is it also because we see it as a relative advantage, the silver lining that our numbers, if you compare it to the other countries, are quite lower, just at 26%, and also the fact that critical sectors like pharma, semiconductors have for now been exempt from the tariffs?
I would say that ours is not a cautious approach, but I would say it's been a proactive approach. You would have noticed that Prime Minister Modi actually undertook a visit to the United States, and one of the key issues that was on the table on the economic charter was this issue of tariff. And you would recall that the announcement for reciprocal tariff was done in the same morning that Prime Minister met with President Donald Trump. And what Prime Minister did was twofold. A, to say that we do not need to limit ourselves to the size of trade that we have at present, but we look for having a larger cake. In other words, the target of $500 billion by 2030, which is a very ambitious target, makes it possible for both sides to have win-win solutions. And it does not have to be a zero-sum game of the current scenario. The second thing that he did was that, they decided to go in for an accelerated trade negotiation so that we can have at least by autumn. And by autumn, that's really a very short period of time. So all that we can expect to get by that time would be early harvest. So in other words, what we are saying is that we do not wish to get into a trade war, which I think is a very wise decision, and particularly because India's share of trade in the American trade basket is very small. So we would have no big impact on the Americans. But if they were to have retaliatory impact on us, that would hit us much more deeply. The second thing that I think has been this word of being a proactive position is that we have also begun consultations to see that our global supply chains, because at the end of the day, when these tariffs hit and in today's globalized world, global supply chains get affected. And so we've tried to ensure that our supply chains we try and keep them as resilient as possible. So I would say proactive rather than cautious. But at the same time, I must say that we need to work on this very expeditiously. Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, spoke to the Secretary of State just a short while ago, I think yesterday, to Marco Rubio. And Piyush Goyal, our Commerce Minister, has been in Washington for negotiations, and our lead negotiators have been in constant contact so that we can come to some sort of an arrangement so that we are not affected. And you rightly pointed out that some of the key areas of our interest are not currently in the list or are in the exemption list. But at the same time, there are a number of items which would take a severe hit. Gems and jewelry, chemicals, apparels, these would be the ones that would be very, very badly affected. Perhaps even our hydrocarbon exports, because we do export a fair amount of refined hydrocarbon. So all these would probably take a bit of a hit, and the stock market has already started reacting to that.
You're right, but as you said, the negotiations are already underway, and the leadership has already taken a proactive approach. So let's hope that when the negotiations take place, we're able to crack a deal which is in favor of us. And remember, the US president has already termed India as a tough negotiator. So let's hope that it works in our favor. But Professor Singh, when Dr. S. Jaishankar was asked about the impact on India, what India's strategy is going to be to lessen the impact of the tariffs imposed, his response was towards the negotiations that India is working with the US on the bilateral trade agreement, and which he said should conclude by fall. Help us and our viewers understand how the BTA is going to take care of the trade imbalance, and will this sort the issue or the sticking points which are related to the tariffs between India and the US?
The US Deputy Trade Representative-led team of 4 members was recently in New Delhi, and they have already started formal negotiations on how to move forward on BTA, bilateral trade agreement. But let me add that the proactive approach of India began, I think, much earlier, before the world was waking up to what is going to happen. So starting from India's budget for this year, India had already kind of shown symbolic gestures as to where India is trying to rectify and do course correction in ensuring that the United States understands India already is responding to things that President Donald Trump was trying to make sure countries do in terms of making bilateral economic relations and trade relations much more balanced. And of course, Prime Minister's visit in February brought this issue much forward and formally announced that the two nations, I think India is an exception here, the first country to formally say that we are going to have a bilateral trade agreement. And even the timeline given by the fall of this year, second half of this year, somewhere we are going to sign a bilateral trade agreement. So I think proactive approach, as Ambassador mentioned, is very much in line with ensuring that it does not become necessarily in favor of India or in favor of United States, but ends up being a win-win situation. And so far, indications from United States are that they appreciate India's proactive approach. And that's why I said when President Trump talks about India imposing 52% of tariffs, United States has imposed about half of it, 26% of tariffs on India. Second thing, I think, which we need to also underline here in terms of India's leverages. India, you notice, have had a trade deficit with the United States, which has been increasing in last several years. I think roughly from about $17 billion in 2021 to about $35 billion last year. Okay. So, that is indeed a matter of concern for United States, and President Trump is very much obsessed with this deficit being a problem. But here, India also is not just rectifying bilateral trade relations here to make sure that we are able to have much more productive relationship. India also has enormous leverages in sort of, for example, signing contracts for defense equipment imports. And that conversation is already taking place, whether it is F-35 or a whole lot of other drones and so on. That whole sector where India is world's largest importer for defense equipment and United States is world's largest exporter for defense equipment will create enormous avenues to blend together and ensure that there are new avenues of building partnerships, and that becomes part and parcel of India's Make in India as well. You see the conversation on small modular reactors for nuclear power generation, that United States is showing interest to do it in India market here and do the production here. And India is wanting not just production, but innovation, research and development as well. So there are enormous leverages we should also underline among major economies that India has. So India is neither seen as a close ally nor seen as an adversary like China, but somewhere in the middle where it creates that maneuvering space for India to ensure the damage limitation and ensure that the relationship continue to be productive for both sides.
Right. Since you spoke about leverages, that takes me to the question on the opportunity which Mr. Piyush Goyal mentioned. Ambassador Bhattacharya, Mr. Piyush Goyal, who is one of the negotiators, happened to speak at an event and he said this challenge presents an enormous opportunity for India. So while the tariffs are sort of reshaping the global economic and trade order, it is chance for India to increase its competitiveness, increase its share in global trade. Tell us how and what are the kind of opportunities that you see this challenge presenting for India?
I think it is now widely recognized in the leadership that although India is the fastest growing major economy, our GDP per capita level is still at a very low base. And in order to achieve the objective of Viksit Bharat by 2047, we will need to have very accelerated growth rates. And our inclusive growth practice will then bring up these poorest people to a much higher level as well. And the consequence of that would be that we would have much higher productivity levels for all Indians. In order to do that, there are three broad areas that I think are being focused, which also pertain to our relationship with the United States. The first is in the regulatory framework. I think the WTO bound commitments that we have in terms of tariffs are still very, very high. And I must be very honest and blunt about this. And that's one of the reasons why somebody like Mr. Trump looks at those headline numbers and he says, oh, but India is the most tariffed country. We need to correct that, because in today's world, We don't need to look at the past, but to see what is our priority for the future. And that regulatory aspect will need to be corrected, along with a large number of NTBs and, SPS standards that we have that actually inhibit the flow of trade. Those are bureaucratic issues which need to be sorted out, and we need to do that. And I think collaborating with the Americans, as well as with the Europeans and Japanese and Singaporeans and others, will stand us to good benefit. The second thing that we really need to do is to improve our manufacturing sector, because over a period of time, we've placed so much of emphasis on the tertiary sector, in which we've done quite well. Our manufacturing has actually slipped. And that had become even more acute when the trade imbalance between India and China shot up, because China was flooding India with cheap products, which led to the deindustrialization of the SME sector in India, which at one point of time was the powerhouse of the Indian economy. Now, with the American assistance, we would be able to work together and to weave into our bilateral trade agreement elements that talk about the contribution of the US investments that will then contribute to the bilateral trade aspects of it, which will not only have better investments, FDI, we would also be able to have higher productivity, skill levels would improve. And of course, we would get into the higher technology niche areas, some of which Professor Singh had also mentioned in defense, in the nuclear energy, and contribute to the other dialogue. The third aspect that we need to look at is that we have to realize that our growth as a geo-economic power also has to be complemented with a certain geostrategic approach and influence that we need to have in our neighborhood, as well as in the larger global spectrum. And for this, what we need is an ally in the United States. Since we will never become an ally of the United States, we will not become an ally of anybody. We need an ally to happen in the United States for India in this particular exercise, so that we can have much greater say in the geopolitics and geostrategy, because today's world is one in which politics and economics always work hand in hand. And so if we are to have a more balanced regime towards our objective of Viksit Bharat, we will need to work with the Americans. And I must say that when Prime Minister went to Washington, D.C. Earlier this year, one of the things that he said was that there was no dissonance between Trump's aspirations for a Make America Great Again and the Viksit Bharat objective that we have. And we can work together so that each of us can recognize the advantages that they have of working, collaborating. And that, I think, is a very great objective that is also partly going to be achieved through these various negotiations.
Okay, Professor, your thoughts on how this challenge, this situation brings India at the crossroads of economic opportunity, and perhaps this could be our chance to improve our financial relationship with countries in the East, address the trade deficit with countries, particularly in the East, and also emerge stronger in the global value chain. That is something that we've been trying to work towards. But this resurgence in trade tensions could be India's chance?
That is true, Tina. I remember two important, significant examples here. When United States had denied India the access to supercomputer, or when India had ensured that Russia does not supply cryogenic engines for India's rockets, both catapulted India into advancing its own alternatives. So sometime when you're pushed to the wall by circumstances like Trump is pushing several countries, not so much India as of now, countries may respond by doing things that will catapult them out of that difficult situation and make them really much more capable in coming times. Second, I think to me, that kind of strategy that President Trump is adopting in terms of giving ultimatums of 24 hours, setting the dates singularly, undermining the whole process, structures, norms of international trading that have existed for a century, to me, that's not very sustainable in my own assessment. We are already seeing a large amount of protests in various cities in the United States. We are reading about the name calling between the top advisor of Trump, Elon Musk, and his top trade advisor, Peter Navarro. We are hearing several of the billionaire supporters of President Trump, like Ken Langon or Ken Griffin and others, are openly becoming critical of tariffs as a strategy. And we saw during his first term also there was trade, technology, tariff wars that existed between the United States and China. So yes, it has created enormous disruption, and several countries and several groups of countries are adopting different methodologies, whether it is going for zero tariffs or it is confronting with slapping similar tariffs, or like India trying to have a conversation and strike a deal in terms of bilateral trade agreement. Whether that strategy is going to be effective, whether that strategy is going to be sustainable, I think we are seeing increasingly questions being placed on that itself. And if you notice that the media is talking about last several weeks having resulted in $6 to $7 trillion of damage to the stock markets, that is going to be also shrinking the kind of heft, economic heft that United States has had. And so therefore, I think whether sustainability of this kind of approach, this strategy, is itself something one has to look at carefully, should also help countries to sort of withstand pressures up to a certain amount of time. Several leaders in United States are today talking that given this chaos, the disruption, the midterm elections will ensure that the Democrats come back to majority in both houses of US Congress, and could create grounds of change of presidency next time we have presidential elections. That is, of course, in the long run.
Right.
But that kind of insinuation, projections are also something that one has to take into account in building either the assessment of what this disruption is going to lead to, or building strategies as to how each country, given its own leverages and equations with President Trump, is going to resolve it. I think advantage India again is that India's leadership has managed so far the personal relationship with the American leadership, whether it is at the level of Secretary of State and Foreign Minister, National Security Advisors, or it is the national leaders, itself is something which should be seen as India's advantage. And second, of course, given the Quad meeting, the summit meeting, which is supposed to happen this year in India, India will have opportunity to actually host President Trump in India. And that also provides enormous maneuvering capacity to India to engage with the leadership of United States and ensure a certain amount of damage limitation and sort of resolving various irritants that exist in bilateral relations. So to me, it looks like when you look at the bigger picture of how the world is dealing with this unleashing of tariff blitzkrieg of President Trump, I think India is relatively in a vantage point and is really proactive in ensuring that those vantage points are utilized to ensure minimum damage in that sense that may occur. Reserve Bank of India, for example, is already talking of GDP growth coming down from 6.7% to 6.5%. But that's a minor adjustment, that is a projection which is being made, which shows that the damage to India is perhaps maybe there's going to be some cost of this disruption, but that perhaps is going to be minimalist, particularly given the proactive approach that Indian leadership has taken on the subject.
Right. And especially, for now, as developments pan out, we see the spotlight on the US and China. But the silver lining is that India, with its proactive approach, may be a silent but a significant winner in how the situation is arising, especially in context of the opportunities that are being created for India, and how we leverage those in the times to come is something that we'll wait and watch. For now, we'll have to wrap up the conversation. Thank you once again to both my guests for joining us on the program, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. To you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well.